Hello and welcome to this video. Up until now on this course, we've been going through the 5-step process with a variety of different photographs and different subjects. So hopefully by now you've got a real handle on things. And so now I want to go on to some more advanced topics. And for this video, we're going to be talking about a technique called frequency separation, which sounds very fancy and also is possibly one of the big things in professional image editing right now. There is a good way to use it, and I've seen more than one demonstrations of terrible ways to use it. And so obviously at this point I'm going to turn around and say I'll show you some good working practices using this technique, but first of all let's show you the general principle. I have this picture. It is couple-kissingstrangers.jpg. Now I downloaded this from Pixabay, but when I checked today that it was still there, I couldn't find it. So what I'll do is, if you're watching this as part of the course, I'll make it available for you as a download. And the reason I've chosen this particular picture is for a couple of reasons. There are a number of blemishes on these people's faces, and there's also some rather harsh highlights on their foreheads and maybe a little bit on their cheeks. And the other reason is they are so likable. If we're going to do a tutorial which uses people's faces, let's have some really nice people up there. Okay, so the basic technique. I have my layer, my background layer, and I'll come up to Filters, Frequency Separation, and you get this. You get two separate views here, and you can slide around like this to check it out. And if I come to my frequency separation radius and I make it bigger, can you see what happens? As I make the radius bigger, the right part of my screen is getting more blurred, and the left part is getting this curious grey layer with rather a lot of quite sharp detail. Look, if I take this down a little bit to about, say, there, for example. Can you see the left side looks a bit like an etching and the right side is getting a little bit blurry? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my radius up until the guy on the right, his forehead starts to get a little bit blurred out. Say about there. In this case, I've chosen 13.9 pixels. Somewhere around there is fine. And the details on the left are really quite pronounced, quite harsh. So I'll click on Apply and watch what happens. Oh, nothing. Well, actually, yes. What's happened is, if you look at the layers panel, instead of having one layer called background, I have two layers. One is called low frequency, one is called high frequency. If I make the high frequency layer invisible for a second, look, there's that blurred layer we just defined, which was on the right when we were setting things up. There it is in all its glory. And then if we take the high frequency layer, if you know your layer blend modes, the high frequency layer is set to linear light layer blend mode. If I turn it to normal blend mode, that's what we've got, basically a grey layer with some sharply defined edges. And from doing the high pass exercise, you will know that when you take a layer which is grey with sharply defined edges and you put it into one of the contrast layer blend modes like overlay, soft light, hard light, or in this particular case, linear light, the low frequency blobby layer plus the high frequency sharply defined layer work together to create the same image you had before, but it's split into two layers. The blurry bits on the layer underneath and the crispy bits on the high frequency layer. Okay, that is the basic concept. Now here's something which I've seen people do as part of a tutorial, and it's a terrible idea. You come to your top layer, your crispy layer. Bear in mind, all it is basically a mid-grey layer with all the edges picked out as either being lighter or darker. Now let's take a look at this guy's forehead, for example. There, you can see it. Now here's one of the things I've seen people say you should do. Come to your paintbrush. My opacity is set to low so I can make repeated brush strokes to build up what I want to do. I'll make sure my color is set to a mid-grey so I can use my slider to come up to, what, 50. This goes from 0 to 100, so if I make it 50, that's bang on a mid-grey. And now, if I come to my high frequency layer, let's just take this little bit here. If I gradually paint over the grey bits, they start to fade. And you don't see much happening at the moment because we need to set this back into linear light mode. But can you see how when I start to paint out those bits, I'm getting some softening and evening out of those highlights? How about that? Or the other thing I've seen people do is come to Clone Stamp tool and they will come to, say, a smooth area like this. And let's take a look at that. Under normal blend mode, you can see just where I'm hovering, it's a fairly smooth area. So let's come back to linear light again. And so from here, you hold down your Alt key to pick up that point, and then you're going to transfer all that much more subtle detail to another area like this, and you can soften the skin like that. Okay, if you want to win yourself a chocolate bar, tell me why both those techniques are bad. The reason they are bad is because we want non-destructive image editing. Now, we've spoken about this before, but what I've done here is I've taken my top layer, my crispy layer, and I've permanently altered it by painting directly onto it. If I decide that I've gone too far with this and I want to backtrack, the only way I can do that is keep on hitting Ctrl or Command plus Z to undo again until I get right back to the start. Now, supposing I'd done all my frequency separation, I'd gone on to do other work, and then I have to come all the way back to here, it's not workable, and you'd be left with a particular mess that you'd created. Alright, so let's go right back to the start and show you some proper ways to do this, but also some extra techniques to really enhance what you're doing. I'll come down to my history panel and I'll slide all the way over to the left to take me back to the start. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate my layer and call it base. Remember, we always keep our background layer intact, so in case we completely mess things up, we can always go back and refer to it again. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an empty layer, and I'll double click to rename that, and I'll call it BR, which stands for blemish removal, because we name our layers as we go along. Then I'm going to come to the quite wonderful in-painting brush tool. It is right here, and as usual, I set to current layer and below. My empty pixel layer is selected so that when I come here, and I'll zoom in a little bit on this guy's face, and select my in-painting brush tool again, make my brush head a bit bigger by tapping my square bracket keys, in this case the right one, and I come in and I start taking out these larger blemishes like the spots or the pimples or the zits or whatever you want to call them. Because sometimes I see people using frequency separation to move things like these spots. When you do that, you are trying to solve two problems with the same technique. It doesn't always work because you saw when I created my frequency separation, one of the layers got blurred. If when I'm creating it, I think, oh, I can see some spots, and I blur so much in that one particular area, I'm forcing maybe too much detail into the crispy top layer. I don't want that. I want to use the frequency separation to deal with the highlights in the forehead and on the cheek and the smaller areas where you have a lot of skin pores. So the larger stuff, like the spots, I take out before I even consider going into the frequency separation layer. So let's see what we can do with this one. I'm going to come back to this and show you how you can deal with these slightly red areas in a different way. But for now, let's go around. Look, I might speed this up because watching me doing the digital version of squeezing someone's spots is not that interesting. Just before we do though, like we said before, there's a birthmark up here. Don't remove the birthmarks. They are a permanent part of someone's face. A spot like this one here, yeah, that's no problem. But the birthmarks, no. Again, that looks like a birthmark to me, so I won't do that. But there's one or two little spots around here I will do. And let's go on to the other person's face as well. And okay, that is most of the larger areas taken care of. Just while I'm here though, I've got one or two little random white areas here, which I don't know what they are, but I think they could do with going, so let's get rid of that, or maybe a little bit there. It is a bit Moorish doing this. You keep on finding lots of tiny little bits, but let's move on. Control or Command plus 0 to zoom to fit. So now I have my base layer with my blemish removal layer covering up the larger stuff on the layer underneath. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and come to Merge Visible. This new layer, that's going to be the layer I will do the frequency separation on, because we need a layer which is a combination of my original layer plus the layer where we hid all the large blemishes. And also, because we are taking our image and we are splitting it into two separate layers, it's important that you do things like the blemish removal, things like red eye removal, plus using the liquify tool to actually alter the shape of a person, which we will come to in a later lecture. We need to do all this stuff before we do frequency separation. Otherwise, you have to try and do those things with an image that's been split into two separate layers and try and do the same thing twice, which is an exercise in not getting it right. And so let's come to filters, frequency separation. Now, because I've already got a composite of my base layer plus the blemish removal layer, because I don't have to worry about the larger stuff, I have more to play with when I come to deciding how blurry I want the lower layer to be and how much crispy detail I want in the upper layer. Now this is a bit of a balancing act. I want to blur out the blurry layer enough so that all those little crispy highlight bits get smeared out into one unified, fairly smooth highlight, which means that I want all the crispy detail on the upper layer. And I think for this, I've got 14.4 pixels. I'll go somewhere around that. Look, I'll go for 12.2 pixels, I think, and I'll click on Apply. Now, just to prove to you that this looks exactly the same as what you were looking at before we divided things up into two layers, I'll select both layers and I will make them both invisible, and you saw absolutely nothing happened. And turn them on again, and you get the same thing. Okay, this is the bit that I suggest you do if you want ultimate flexibility. Choose the high frequency layer, and then, look, it's really simple. We've done this plenty of times before. You come down and you add a layer mask to it. The layer mask is white, so you can see all of the high frequency crispy top layer. And let's come to our paintbrush. Let's check my settings. I am using a brush from the basic tab. I'm using a simple soft round brush. My opacity I will set down to somewhere fairly low. Now, because this is a tutorial, I will set it on the high side of low. I'll set it to about 15% so you can see the effect quickly. If you are doing this and you want to do a careful job, you might want to set that lower and use more brush strokes to build up the opacity of your brush strokes. Hardness, well, no, I want that set right down to 0%. And because I have a white layer mask, which means you can see everything, I want to be able to paint in black. Remember, black conceals, white reveals, and let's make our brush size a bit smaller by tapping my square bracket key to about there. As before, I will zoom in. Select my brush once more, and none of these little buttons across the top are ticked, so it's just a very basic brush, set 15% opacity, and my layer mask is selected, and I will paint in black, and here we go. Can you see? As I'm painting, we're gradually fading out those little bitty highlights which are on his forehead. And the really nice thing is, if I make this invisible for a second, with the layer mask deactivated, you can see all the original detail is there. Now, I think maybe I've gone a little bit too strong with that, so I can come and instead of painting with black, I can paint with white, and I can paint those details back in as much as I want. And if I decide all of a sudden that's too much, swap again, and I can paint them back out again. That's because we are using layer masks instead of just scrubbing away in grey on the actual layer itself, and so it's non-destructive. You can do this as much as you want. Now, because my brush is set to 15% opacity, which I'll be honest with you is a little bit stronger than I'm used to, I'm finding I'm knocking out areas a little bit faster than I would like. And so if the effect looks a little bit too strong, I am sorry, but it needs to be something you can see clearly. Now, a few things to bear in mind when you're doing this. You can go into crease areas like this, but for things like, look, there's a bit of stubble there, be very careful when you're in those areas because you'll end up blurring the whole thing out, which doesn't look very nice. So I'll hit Control or Command plus C a few times to get rid of that. And you know what? I will zoom to fit as well and make my brush size bigger because we're all on the clock. This whole area here, that was the problem area, I think. I can get rid of all of that stuff around there. Well, I can reduce all the stuff which is on the top crispy layer as much as I want. Try and be careful around the hairline for the same reason. You don't want to blur those too much. And I will call a halt on that face for now. Let's take a look at the other one. I'm doing this zoomed out for the larger areas. For the finer areas, that will be the areas which are closer to the eyebrows, for example, where you have a lot of fine detail. You do want to come in a little bit more closely and use a smaller brush. So you can target all the small details without cutting too much into, well, things like the bits of hair that are dangling down. You'll notice how I'm trying to avoid going over those as much as possible. Let's zoom out for a second, and if I make my layer mask invisible, all of a sudden the detail is looking quite crispy, and with the layer mask reapplied, suddenly looking not nearly as crispy, and we get to control which bits of your picture look crispy and which bits don't. Incidentally, with this technique, everyone uses it for skin, but if I look in the background, there's a little bit of digital noise it looks like in the background. I can guarantee that's going to be on the top layer, so I can also use this to deal with one or two noise issues in the background. Like underneath here, there aren't any skin blemishes in the shadow area down here, but because it's a digital photo and you find noise in shadow areas of the digital photo, you can also tackle any noise issues like this, because I'm taking away the top crispy layer and leaving behind the soft focus area underneath. And if you remember, that's exactly what noise reduction techniques do. They soften bits. So there you go. Noise reduction as well. It's not just for faces. Okay, so you're watching me doing this and you can see I get this precision control. Maybe that is not fast enough for you. Oh, all right. We'll take our top crispy layer and we'll duplicate it, and you end up with this rather interesting hyper-textured effect, which can be used as a special effect because, as you know, you can stack layers which are in different layer blend modes. But I'll make the bottom layer invisible for a second, and for the top layer, look, I'll just get rid of the layer mask there. So I'm left back to where we started. Now watch. Come to Layer, New Live Filter Layer, come to Blur, Gaussian Blur. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our top crispy layer, we're going to preserve alpha so the effect goes right to the edges of the screen, and then we'll start to up the radius like this. And I'll do it until what? I've got 8.5 pixels, and you can see all those highly detailed highlights have all got blurred out. Then for this, guess what? Well, we know that adjustment layers and live filter layers have their own layer mask built in, so paintbrush is already selected. Black is selected. Look for this, I'm going to crank this right the way up to 100% because, like I say, we're on the clock. I will come to my Gaussian blur layer and I will Control or Command plus I to invert it. So now the built-in layer mask is in black, so I need to paint in white. Now I did crank it up to 100%. Come on, let's not get stupid. Let's take it to about 49%, which is already pretty high. And I can just come in, paint out all the details I want. Whoops, went too far. I went into the stubble area. I didn't want to do that. And I can just come in and paint out all the detail that I want blurred, like this. I'm working at breakneck speed with this, but I'm also trying to avoid the sharper areas. It's not an easy thing to do, but I just want to show you this alternative technique in case you thought the previous one was a bit long-winded. This is the quick way. I wouldn't say it's the quick and dirty way, but it is the quick way. And you do it that way. And here's the really fun bit. It's a live filter layer, so I can just double click on it and I can adjust the radius to whatever I need it to be. Look, if I take it right the way down, that's what my original layer looked like. But if I take my radius and just start tapping and making it higher, not only do I get to control how opaque this filter is, but I also get to control how blurry it makes things underneath. So this is a ridiculous amount of fine control, and it's all non-destructive. Okay, so we're nearly there. What I will do is I don't want both techniques there at the same time, so I will get rid of this top layer. I will make my original layer visible again, because there's still some work we can do with this. If you look at the person on your right, you can see the side of the face still has some blotchy areas. Also, the person on the left, just above one of the eyebrows, there's still a slight blobby area there. Okay, so bear in mind with frequency separation, all it is just 2 layers. And if I make the top layer invisible, there is no reason at all you can't start doing things to the bottom layer. So again, I am going to come to Layer, New Light Filter Layer, and I'm going to apply a Gaussian blur, Gaussian or Gaussian or whatever you want to call it, to my low frequency layer, my blobby color layer. Preserve alpha so that the edges aren't affected by this, and then I'm going to crank up the radius even more to something pretty high like this. You see how ridiculously blobby the whole thing's gone? But watch this. I select my layer. As before, I press Ctrl or Command plus I to invert, so the built-in layer mask is now making everything invisible. My brush is selected. White is there as before. I'll take my opacity up to 100% just to show you the theory before I show you in action. Let's take a look just on the side of that guy's cheek, and I will paint a white blob right there. And if I press Ctrl or Command plus Z, watch what I did. You see that? I'm revealing the really blurry Gaussian blur layer when I paint in white on it. So if I combine my layers together like this, watch what happens with that when the blurry layer and the crispy layer are combined. My Gaussian blur layer is selected, I'm painting in white, I'm painting it at 100%, and bang. That blotchy area just seemed to disappear. What about this little spot which is just on the side of his face there? It goes. What about this bit here? There's a little bit of, what is it, maybe a scab there? I bet you that's on the high frequency layer. So if I come to my mask there and I come, yes it is. So let's swap. So I'm painting a black there. That's too hard. Let's take that down to 37% and I can fade that out as much as I want. And can you see how by going between the two different layers, let's go back to my Gaussian blur layer, paint in white, opacity 100%. I now have basically a ridiculous amount of control over what gets blurred and what doesn't. Like this whole side of the face was quite textured, let's call it that. A part of that texture is on the low frequency layer, which I'm currently blobbing out. Let's come to this other person's face and do the same thing here. Just where I don't want it. What about that area here? Yeah, I can really take that down. Also a little bit maybe around here. And if I click again, I can change the radius of this on the fly. Look, with the lower layer less blurry, you see more of the detail. But when I start to make the radius bigger, that detail just seems to disappear on the fly. This is a real world portrait. Not two models sitting in a studio, it's two very nice looking people taking a selfie which I hope they really like. And if this goes on someone's wall, as with every other photo in this series, chances are this is the kind of photo that's going to be seen by these people or close family. They know what they look like. And if someone looks at this photo and says, what a lovely photo, didn't the photographer do a great job of getting rid of all the slight marks on the side of the face, then I've failed. But if they look at this photo and think, what a lovely photo, then I've succeeded. And for that reason, I'm still going to leave a little bit of the slight roughness just on the side of his face. Birthmarks are still there, although I can be a bit cheeky and I can partially take out that one on the end of the nose if I wanted, or the ones here, just by targeting either the mask on the high frequency layer or the Gaussian blur on the low frequency layer. The two work together to create the image as a whole, and you soon get the hang of knowing which bits of detail is likely to belong where. Like for example, I've just noticed it looks like there's a slight scar indentation on the side of this person's face on the left. I bet you that's going to belong more in the low frequency layer. Let's try it. Yeah. That will reduce it. Now, people who know this person well will know that that scar is there. But if you look carefully, you can see we've reduced it, but we haven't taken it away altogether. Let's take a look with the blemish removal layer invisible. So this is what we started out with. This is what we've ended up with. It looks realistic, it looks natural, but it looks better. And you have complete control over how much you want this to affect everything. Look, one thing I didn't say, for example, is that Gaussian blur layer. I can have any percentage visibility from completely invisible through partially visible to fully visible. You've got a massive amount of control and hugely editable. Okay, I am very nearly there with this, just out of force of habit and just to show you previously learned techniques once more. Let's throw in a couple of master layers, shall we? So top layer is selected. For this, I want to use the usual master adjustment, so come down to our adjustments tab. I want to start off with a HSL layer. On top of that, I want a curves layer, and on top of that, I want a color balance layer. Let's take a look at what we've got. I should really rename these. Let's work efficiently, shall we? HSL, master, curves, master, and because I'm getting lazy, CB for color balance, master. Let's start off with the bottom one first, because remember, things build on top of each other. So the HSL will affect everything underneath it, the curves will affect the HSL and everything underneath that, and the color balance master will affect everything on top. So HSL. The reason I prefer these three different master layers is because with the HSL, you've got a choice. You can either just shift everything around like this, which is very artistic, but not what I want, or I can target certain areas because I think their skin tone looks a little bit red. I don't know because I don't know them. I got this picture from Pixabay, but let's assume I'm right just for a second. Maybe I want that with a little bit less red, so I will choose my red color band there. I will come to my picker and let's find something representative, let's say around there, and you can see my little control node shifted around. I just want a very slight overall hue shift in the red areas, not towards magenta because that just looks terrible. I will double click that, but just maybe just a degree or two, even minus 3.6, I think I'm seeing an improvement there. So I'll do that. Now what about my curves? I'm going to use this to sort out the overall dark and light. And I notice that there's hardly any very light color pixels. You can see that because my histogram suddenly drops off before we get to 100% bright. So I've got a little bit to play with here. So if I take my end and I move it like this, I can make the whole thing brighter, like that. Now, do I want any contrast around the middle? Yeah, maybe I'll just pull things down just a little bit towards the mid to darker areas. Do I want anything here to make the highlights more spread out? No, I'm not sure I do. I will backspace to get rid of that. I use the master curves to control the overall dark to light. Now, I know there are going to be people out there who are going to say, you can do everything just using curves. You don't need the HSL layer and you don't need the color balance layer because curves are wonderful and I love curves and curves make me look like I'm a professional designer. Look, for this, I want one layer doing one job. I use the HSL master layer for overall broad color shifts, plus target certain color bands like I targeted the reds and moved them around. I just want the curves master for the overall dark to light, and I'll use the color balance for fine-tuning the color balance in the darker areas and the lighter areas. One layer doing one job. I find that an efficient way to work, and I don't end up with my curves layer looking like a few different strands of spaghetti all fighting to make the picture look good. So for the color balance, let's take a look. Well, let's start off with shadows. Do you remember in a previous video how I moved a bit towards cyan and things started moving to life? Well, let's try that here, because I think the shadow areas are a little bit reddish and a little bit warm for my tastes. Let's move it along. Yes, I do like that. I prefer it. It's a little bit cooler. It's only -5, -6%, but I think it definitely makes a difference. Well, if I made things cooler with cyan, now what about blue? That'll also make things slightly dark, slightly blue. I'm not so sure about that. I'll double click to get rid of that. Let's try magenta and green as well, because as we know, magenta has a huge impact on people's skin tone. Or to put it another way, its opposite, green, makes skin look awful. So let's take that back again. Do I want any magenta in there? Originally, I thought this photo was a bit too magenta, which I sorted out using the HSL master, so why would I start adding magenta in at this stage? That shadows, midtones. I want to avoid magenta and green. Well, blue I don't want. What about a little bit of yellow? I'm guessing a little bit here because I don't know these people and I don't know what the lighting conditions are. I'll maybe just push that just a tiny bit towards yellow. Now, what about cyan, red? Actually, just a little bit more cyan in the midtones as well, I think is helping there. So I've gone for -8. Now, what about highlights? Not sure about this. Do I want colder highlights? No, I do not like that. Warmer highlights? No, they're too warm. I will double click to reset that. Magenta, again, no. Green, oh dear me. Although that gives you a clear idea when you see that. Look, it says here we're targeting the highlights and it's only the lighter areas that are being affected badly by this, but please let's take that back down to 0. Now what about cyan? Red, definitely not. Cyan, no. Again for this, I'm just going to leave the highlights alone. Okay, let's take a look at the whole thing. Now, rather than selecting everything and making them invisible, I can just come to my History tab, which is open, and slide everything back to there. That's what we started out with. If I slide the Position tab back, that's what we've ended up with. And you know what? Let's just do the last thing, because at the end of the previous lesson, I showed you a very simple way to create a vignette. That's where you make the edges of your screen slightly darker. Let's show you a more advanced way and then a much more advanced and flexible way. For the more advanced way, well, I need a pixel layer to work with because it's a filter. And so for that, I suppose I could use the low frequency layer, except that a lot of it is invisible. So what I'm going to have to do with this is come up to my top layer and, as we've done before, merge visible so that everything that you saw on screen suddenly gets placed onto one layer. And so from here, we can just come to Layer, New Light Filter Layer, and Colors, Vignette. And the nice thing about this is it does it all for you. Sometimes it can feel like you're trying to nail fog to the wall when you use a filter like this because you can't really see what you're doing. To make things easier, take the exposure and take it right the way down so you can see the vignette very clearly. From there, you can start altering things like the shape of it, like this. And I need a shape about like there. The scale needs to be quite a bit bigger so that the whole thing gets pushed out towards the side. And also the hardness as well. Let's make the hardness a lot softer so the actual edges of the vignette are more blurry, but that's pushed it back in towards the middle. So come back to the scale and just rock the sliders around in relation to each other. And when you get something which you think, yeah, that's what I want, then you take the exposure, let's set it to 0, and then you just darken things to taste like that. So supposing that's what I want, great. Because it's a live filter layer, it can be altered at any time, but let's take a look before and after. Without the vignette, and you find because the corners of your screen are slightly darker, it naturally makes you focus more on the main subject, which in this case is the people. Okay, that's one way to do it. I will just get rid of that. Very simple, very straightforward. Here's the more complicated way, but gives you the ultimate amount of flexibility. I am going to create, well, I can use a number of different ones here. Let's come to recolor. I could use another HSL layer just as easily. And with the recolor layer, it just colors everything any color you want, any amount of saturation you want, from gray to a little bit of blue to really in your face blue, and also the light dark like this. I am also going to add, from my shapes menu, an ellipse. Just drag it out like this. I'm going to take both of those layers by shift clicking, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to put them inside a group. I'm going to take my ellipse and I'm going to drag it underneath my recolor adjustment layer, and I'm going to set the layer blend mode to erase. And what that does is make the ellipse invisible, but it shows a recolor layer above it. And while I'm here, come on, let's do what we're supposed to do and name our layers. Stay organized. Vignette. Right, now this is where it gets fun. Come to my ellipse. If I come down to layer effects, I can turn on Gaussian, Gaussian, blur, whatever you want. Make sure Preserve Alpha is not selected, and you can blur it as much as you want. If that's not blurry enough, if you can change it to, well, let's try 250 pixels so I have a very feathered looking vignette, which at the moment is looking quite blue. But the nice thing about it is I can come back to my recolor adjustment layer and yes, it's looking blue. What color vignette would you like? Would you like it dark blue? Would you like it a dark purple or magenta? I think for me, I quite like that. And also, it doesn't have to be a normal blend mode. What about if I put it into multiply blend mode, which makes everything look dark? I can use any one of the dark and blend modes to do this for different effects. I'll go with multiply because I find with photography, the multiply blend mode tends to give fairly natural results. Look, here's the nice thing as well. Look, my lips as well. I can alter it to wherever I want. In fact, look, I will zoom out a little bit with this so that I can see a bit more clearly what I'm doing. And there you go. Put it where you want. Supposing I want it about there. And also bear in mind as well, I can come to my entire vignette layer and I can make that completely transparent or as opaque as I want. Any color, tone, or saturation I want for the actual vignette itself, instead of it being just going towards black, choose whatever you want. You've got much more flexibility there. You can alter the size and the feathering on the ellipse as much as you want, but look, there's even more. Supposing I like this in general, but there's a little highlight just in the top right-hand corner, which, well, maybe I would like that to be there. Not a problem. Come to our vignette group and click on the little cog icon and we can do layer blend ranges, which we saw in the very first video. And for this, come to our underlying composition ranges. I'll put down a control point in the middle of my graph line and I will take this point down like this. Now what that means is anything lying underneath this layer, the lighter it is, the more it shows through. And did you see that? I'll do it again. See that light in the background? It's not showing through at all. As I make things brighter, you'll notice the darker areas in the background aren't being affected at all, but the lighter areas are starting to show out more. So you have a huge amount of control over which bits of the background get affected by the vignette. Now I'll probably go for something like that, or I can move along like this so that only the very darkest parts of the background are affected, or the midtones of the background are affected. And so if you can show me a more flexible way to add a vignette to a non-destructive photo, please let me know. All right, just finally with that, I'm finding that blue a little bit too intense. I will just lower down the saturation so it's like that, and maybe alter the color just a tiny bit. Purple doesn't really work. I'll go more towards a turquoise dark like this. All right, let's take it right back to the start again. That's what we started out with. We used frequency separation plus a few master layers to control things, then the vignette, and we ended up with that. And any part of what we've just done, we can edit as much as we want. And as long as we save this, in fact, I will do it now and I'll make this available to you. Kissing Strangers. Finished. I'll zip that up, and if you're watching this on the course, that will be available for you to have a play around with. Okay, so in the next lesson, we're going to be talking about dodge and burn techniques, which is another technique which is absolutely central when you're editing portraits. And I think I'll probably start that video by telling you why you never ever do dodge and burn by using the dodge and burn tools. That's coming up in the next video. I'll see you there.